The big challenge is we have our global operating system that nobody pays for. And $100 trillion GDP a year that's utterly dependent upon this machine to keep working and provide water and carbon dioxide removal and all these things that we need to function. And those dependencies aren't priced into our global economy.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance, exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and today I am joined by Karl Burkart. He is the co-founder and deputy director of One Earth. People who watch this show may remember we had Justin Winters, co-founder of One Earth, on in season 1. So it's a great pleasure here at New York Climate Week 2024 to welcome you. Thanks, Karl, for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Very excited.
Awesome. Yeah, me too. This is going to be a fun conversation. So Climate Week, you know, you've probably done, I don't know how many of these, but what are you noticing and how's it been so far?
Yeah, I think I've done 10.
Wow.
So it's kind of not Climate Week anymore. It's Climate and Nature Week and
Right.
a little bit of regen ag. We're not getting there quite there yet, but yeah, it's really fully climate and nature. And this has been tricky for me because I run the science and strategic impact at One Earth. So that's become a very broad scientific program. So we are most famous probably for One Earth climate model. So I'm kind of running between the climate energy transition spaces over to the nature finance, nature data spaces back and forth. And at One Earth, I think how we kind of got started is we need to look at these two things at the same time. So that does make Climate Week pretty exhausting, I will say, but it's been really fruitful and exciting to see who's sort of uptaking and starting to kind of adopt language that you and I probably have used for 10 years, but bankers in Wall Street who I was hanging out with all day yesterday, are starting to use. So that's kind of some of my takeaways are how, in some ways, how mainstream it's starting to become. So that feels like a positive. It's been good, but yeah, a bit tiring.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you feel like we're all kind of rowing in the same direction, or what are your observations about how the space is maturing?
No. Yeah, we're definitely rowing. It's a flotilla. It's not, there's a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah.
So in some ways we kind of can't all row together, but yeah, I mean, there is a lot of conversation. So the interesting, I don't know if you want to get into this, but it's an area I avoided, but the carbon markets, I've been dipping in and out of those conversations because they kind of are a bridge between the kind of the climate agenda and the nature agenda. They have been. And so one of my self assignments here was to kind of see what Deloitte and what is PwC and what is Accenture, how are they positioning the moment around this? Because, you and I know the big challenge is we have, our global operating system that nobody pays for. And, $100 trillion GDP a year that's utterly dependent upon this machine to keep working and provide water and carbon dioxide removal and all these things that we need to function. And those dependencies aren't priced into our global economy. So carbon markets were one sort of baby step towards trying to do that. And they collapsed badly, the voluntary nature-based carbon, which is the one we were interested in. They had tons and tons of problems. But we're really at it's hard to imagine it getting worse. And there were some big announcements this week around that. So that it's not my favorite topic, but actually I decided to spend quite a bit of time on that because I wanted to see what the mainstream world was thinking about, how to start pricing this stuff in. So that, that's one interesting takeaway. It depends on who you're talking to. There's Leaf Coalition made this huge announcement and a big deal with tribes and Amazonian tribes for a big offtake agreement for companies to buy really, really high quality avoided deforestation credits. So that's trying to reboot the RED market, which is reduced emissions from avoiding deforestation. and then Symbiosis, which is this other big corporate thing for restoration. So essentially, that's a huge part of the One Earth climate model. We need an absolutely monumental amount of land restoration to occur to absorb our legacy historic carbon emissions.
Yep.
And so that was a big, that's an exciting momentum. So in terms of like the one tool we seem to currently have to try and get markets to provide capital for nature, it's not going well. 28 cents a ton right now on the spot market. So it's part of that is just that there's very little, there's no AAA rated credits. So we now actually have somebody who's rating credits, which we didn't even have. So there's kind of like new pieces in the market are starting to come together. So that's interesting watching something that was like really just an idea of NGOs like 20 years ago and struggling for them to try and create something like a market, and it collapsed and failed, and now market makers are coming in. So I spent all day yesterday at ICE, which runs the New York Stock Exchange and a lot of other stock exchanges and compliance markets. And it was the absolutely number one asked question was about carbon markets and how they're going to work and can we scale it? We need to get it to about $50 billion a year, which, still a relatively small market, if you will, but like compared to their markets. But we're at like, we're in the dumpster right now. Yeah, it's like not very, very, very little. So that's, but yeah, so seeing those, it is, partially it's a little scary too, because like these are like, bankers, right? And like the science of capitalism trying to figure out, but then you're like, wow, it's like I was sitting next to the head of ESG allocation at Citi, and she's really taking this seriously. So I think that is inspiring, I guess a little cautionary, but yeah, seeing that maybe the world seems to be catching up with this.
Yeah. I'm less frightened when I see the people and I meet them and I see pure motivation and intent. I'm more frightened by the what are the incentive structures that are actually underpinning, because people can come and go, we can wear different logos on our hats, but like the machinery of capitalism, the incentive structures is what's really needs to be evolved in order for us to have this living machine on our planet that provides all these ecosystem services that are fundamental to our survival to persist, right?
Yeah. No, 100%. I don't think they still quite get, like I even was explaining like how the carbon sinks work, because a lot of people they forget that it's like nature's already taken off half of our emissions every year.
Right.
So one of the themes was risk, like a risk to markets from climate, and I was trying to bring in risk to markets from nature, because if you read Johan Rockström's stuff on planetary boundaries, we know actually nature is like way past like where climate's like pretty chill compared to the level of urgency around nature and biodiversity collapse. That's a lot of the area. We spent a lot of time on energy transition for about 10 years, and we're really like focusing 80%, I'd say at this point, on nature, because that's the stuff we really have to figure out. But like, it's almost kind of like it there were looks of being like perplexed, like what would happen? Like, so, all right, in the Europe, we have the beginnings of like really serious regulation on disclosure. Like companies have to disclose their risk exposure for their nature assets. So they're starting to take it really seriously, but it's also like the idea that half of your emissions every year are taken up and you don't do anything for that. So what happens when, one of the things we studied in the One Earth climate model is what carbons, and so your viewers probably know this, but the carbon sinks is land and ocean take up about roughly 50%. Ocean's a bit more than land. But that, like no one's paying for that. And so like, the predictions are that is in decline. And depending on like Timothy Lenton's here, you probably know about his tipping points. There's 11 tipping points that we're going to cross between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees Celsius in global temperature rise.
Right.
And markets, the people who model markets are the good ones, even are modeling sort of curves. I guess I need to describe it for people who are listening, but curves that are kind of like gentle, let's call it gentle exponential curves.
Mm.
So our risk is gently exponentially going up.
Right.
And then you have the economists at Yale that are like, yeah, it's going to just be a little hotter at 5
Right.
degrees C. It's no big deal, right?
Right.
Nordhaus. I'm just going to name him because
Yeah.
it's like, I don't even know how he has an academic position, but he also has a Nobel Prize. So there you go. But the way tipping points work, of course, is the famous thing where you have a chair
Mhm.
and, you're gently lowering the chair and you're modeling that gradual curve of risk. And then at some point, gravity takes over, the chair
Yeah.
falls to the ground, and that's
Yeah.
tipping point.
Yeah.
So there's 11 of them, right?
Mm.
Like
That we
AMOC,
know about.
that we know about.
Right.
Permafrost, AMOC, which is the Gulf current, the forest, the dehydration, desiccation of forest.
Yeah.
So what is like, if one of those goes, what does that do to markets?
Mhm.
And then what does that do to this assumption? Because most climate models just sort of assume this like constant machine is just working in the background. And
Mhm.
I remember when I first, so I was at Leonardo DiCaprio's foundation building the science and policy program, and I get to talk to everybody, including Johan Rockström, anyone who would pick up my call. And yeah, I got to really getting my head around like, okay, so like climate modelers just assume that's a given
Mm.
to 2100 and beyond. And like there's at the time, this was like back 2017, we were forming this program, like there was almost no modeling on, is that true? Like is the ocean going to decline? Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? Is land get like, what's going to happen as the planet warms? What does
Yeah.
that do to that machine? And so, so we have that in our model now. We were one of the first to have it. And so it's not a given. And then then what does that do with carbon?
Mhm.
Like your price on carbon, if suddenly the machine that you're assuming is just taking up 50% of your responsibility
Right.
doesn't work as well. And what does that do? So there's kind of, it's, I mean, the thing is the risk, people who are risk, like insurers, like they're obviously really
Mhm.
interested in what's there. Like probably some of the smartest people in the world are hired by insurance companies to start figuring this stuff out now.
Right.
But yeah, it was still like, even explaining that to that audience, like just like kind of the looks of being like slightly puzzled, like, oh yeah, okay.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think it brings up several points in my mind. I mean, one is that we have generally a generation of humans alive today who are ecologically illiterate, myself included. I mean, we just didn't get taught a lot
No,
of these
yeah.
basic ideas and concepts and understandings of how our world works. But I also, it's interesting because you've been in the space a long time. You were with Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation before One Earth. I would love to at some point, touch on that a bit more. But you're deep in the science. One Earth is also excellent at communicating, synthesizing, trying to make this stuff understandable. But when you get deeper into the models, my impression is like, there's also more and more uncertainty and humility that you have to have because it's impossible to know, how all these different dynamic systems are going to interplay. And it's an interesting paradox because I feel like the climate movement around global warming and carbon has almost had to take this stance of like, no, 99 point X% of scientists agree and we have certainty. And then there's the counter response of like, you don't really know, and so it's like, it's kind of like, no, we just know it's really bad. We don't know how bad and which tipping points in which order, but like, trust us, But yeah, how do you think about that set of trade-offs between certainty, uncertainty, humility, and yet trying to communicate the degree of the problem?
I love that question. I spent so much time thinking about this because, like you said, Leonardo's foundation, the core of the foundation is he donated his social media platforms to the cause, essentially.
Mm.
And so we were managing, this very small team of an audience of like 80 million people. And meanwhile, we're also funding climate models. So like, how do we and monitoring social media response to various narratives was really fascinating.
Mm.
And then how do you communicate this to a broad audience? So like, there's, I would say, two profoundly different approaches. And one is let's label them. One is doom and gloom. Okay. The other one is hopeful solutions. Doom and gloom is the dominant paradigm, and it's the one that activists, industrial complex really likes, and
Mm.
and big foundations like to fund that. Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation did a lot of messaging urgency, is what it's called. But what we realize, especially when you're dealing with a large young audience, that we were seeing countless messages saying, "I'm going to kill myself. This is too scary. This is
Mm.
I can't deal with this. Like, I'm just gonna like let's just check." And I started screenshotting some of these, like, let's all just party until we all die.
Mm.
Like, this is over, game over. Thanks, boomers, you killed it. Like, I mean, it was just
Mhm.
endless, just the profound like negativity and hopelessness. We were manufacturing hopelessness.
Mm.
And I say we, collective we, like
Yep.
everyone who was the leading minds in
Yeah.
climate
Message
communications,
urgency and
like,
doer.
and we
Yeah.
still have these brands like, we don't have time, like it's too late, like all these like campaigns that people think are helpful.
Mm.
And I mean, I'll just say it like Greta, the whole Greta framing is just like a red. Okay, let me just put it out there, because I've been watching and thinking about this, especially this week. There's a school, the school of thought believes that if you present hopeful solutions and constructive paths forward, you're hurting the world.
Mm.
You're making it hard, because they feel like it's sort of detracting from the more important message, which is urgency.
Mhm.
So hope, like the idea of hope is an off ramp, um, is in their mind, in a lot of people's minds. And this is funders and also activists and
Mhm.
NGOs. The entire complex has been built, which I was very much a part of
Mhm.
building, because I
Mhm.
was part of, before DiCaprio Foundation, I was at GCCA, which ran a lot of climate campaigns. The Tick 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 campaign, which is a
Mm.
huge campaign for Copenhagen, big Copenhagen climate agreement. Well, it was catastrophe as it was an agreement in 2009 with. But yeah, I go way back. So like the idea was to build narratives of like doom and gloom, because that was like going to motivate politicians and screaming and shouting and waving signs and crying. Yeah. And so yeah, so I don't totally diss it, because I understand where they're coming from. That they, like when One Earth was founded, we had this. I remember we had this meeting, and we're just like, we we're like, people are really not mentally well.
Yeah.
Like, we're making things worse for them,
Mm.
and we may be accurately communicating data points, but
Mm.
like, they're checking out, and we need
Mm.
them to be checked in. We need to build a climate movement that's actually like, this is the vision, where we have a vision of the future we want. We're going to create that. We don't want them checking out. And so One Earth was born out of that kind of conflict,
Right.
where, well, we have to there why isn't there a brand,
Mm.
a nonprofit that is dedicated to like building a vision of the future that we want? And like, what are all the specific things we need to do to make that vision happen? And what are various roles people can play in that? So that's
Mhm.
kind of like the genesis of One Earth. And yeah, like at the time, we got a lot of, can I swear on this? I don't know.
Please.
We got a lot of shit for that. A lot. I will tell you, yes, I have had my ears yelled at many times by other big NGOs and things that were like, you're train wrecking what we're doing, blah, blah. So yeah, so anyway, we were kind of a black sheep when we launched, because we were really the only one. And now
Mhm.
I think we've really seen the past 3 years, we're just slightly
Yeah.
ahead of the curve. That
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
we have lots of people working on hopeful messages, and like,
Mm.
we can do this. And yeah, but even to this day, natural climate solutions, for example, like I was at, at Leo's Foundation. We were early funder in Project Drawdown. We were early
Mhm.
funder in natural climate solutions, like Bronson Grissom's paper, which led that framework, which kind of linked nature and climate. And so we were early in on all that. But yeah, one set of funders who I knew very well working on the energy side were not happy
Mm.
about us focusing on nature, because they felt, well, you're giving people a panacea. It's like an easy out. We need
Mhm.
to like, focus on really hard stuff. And shutting down coal plants and things like that, which, super important. But we just were like, well, we feel like there's space for something else.
Yeah. Yeah, and over the years in my conversations with Justin, it always stood out that there was this three solutions pillar that you all had, where it was, we got to make the transition to renewables, right? And that's going to help address the carbon climate, challenges. We have to conserve land, 30 by 30 as a stepping stone into, really half of the planet being protected in its natural habitat, and then the regenerative agriculture, piece. Is that still how you guys think about it?
Yeah. So I mean, like, tooting our own horn, I'm really, really proud of this climate model that we created. I mean, it was.
Tell me about the climate model.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't thinking we talked about it, but it probably is actually good context.
It underpins so much.
It really does. It's so nice to have a space where you're willing to like let me unload all.
Please go.
But yeah, it really, am proud of it. I mean, so we had been funding quite a lot of like advanced research in renewable transition. We were one of the very first to come out 100% renewable energy. It was a big fight. Even I, like, biggest renewable, that's my background. Like I was like, I don't think we can say 100%. Like, can we just say like 95? And yeah, so we 100%, we were early. We funded research at Stanford on that. And then, that's what you said. I love what you said about humility, because this is the thing, is the more you know, the more humble you become, because you just realize, oh my God, that just opened up 85 more doors.
Right.
We have to go through. And like, I think I'm awesome, but I just scratching the surface. Yeah. So we realized, and that was an all electric, the model we had been working on at Stanford. And we realized that is not going to work. And this may be controversial for your podcast, I don't know, but like when you look at constraints of critical minerals, two things. First, just transition. So that's like an all electric transition, even all electric transition, even if we could do it, isn't going to be a just transition. It's going to leave a lot of people out of the new economy. So just transition means like we need to reemploy, we need to like move people in, and all electric is very Silicon Valley friendly, because it actually requires quite a concentration of wealth and resources, and our current energy system, it's terribly problematic, but it is quite distributed. So it means there's lots of different kinds of people playing. Second one was critical minerals. As we learned more and more about that, our model, actually, chapter 11 of our first version of the climate model, which was done with 17 scientists, like including German Aerospace, which is like sort of like Germany's NASA, and a bunch of energy modelers and greenhouse gas modeling people. And so two really innovative things in that. First, we did a chapter on critical minerals. So how much is out there, how much can we use, how much can we recycle? Second one was we did the first actual like Monte Carlo analysis on the technical potential of carbon dioxide removal from enforced biomes. So lots of people had put little papers out, and some of them important, about like maybe we can get about this much from these different methods of restoration. But we actually we built a model so that modelers could take that in and use it to get their carbon removal.
Cool.
Because in any climate model, you need to lower your carbon and then you need to remove carbon.
Right.
So we actually created like a nature-based method to remove carbon in climate models. It's very boring, but it was actually quite exciting. And yeah, so that model brought those things together, and we realized, we need this very diverse, very complex transition. So yeah, like in our model, you get to about 69% electrification, and then the rest is all sorts of other renewable modalities. And then on top of that, you need a ton of nature restoration. So yeah, so like you said, so out of that model, which is actually, there's technically there's three models that feed into that. One's the energy transition, one's the nature conservation restoration models. Those are two separate ones. And then there's a new one coming out on how do you feed 10 billion people, essentially. So it's like an optimizing land use for nutrition availability as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to crop yield, which is the kind of dominant metric. So
Mm-hmm.
modeling that all at global scale, right? Because we don't have the answer unless we get the. So those are the kind of the three pillars, right? Energy, nature, food, if you
Mm-hmm.
will. But food is also food and fiber because there's
Right.
agricultural commodities. And that is the framework. So we landed on that three pillar thing, and then we realized got to unpack all of that. So each of those, we have the solutions framework, which has set now 77. We added 177 solutions, um, each of which play a very kind of specific role in the transition, and you can kind of unpack further. So we're working on doing all that because it's actually people like we found out like high school like teachers are using it. So
Right.
now we're like, oh, okay, we're like getting through to communicate this complexity. So that's kind of part of what we were doing with that. But yeah, those three pillars are really
What would
important.
be some examples of those 77 solutions to make this concrete?
Yeah, well, like on the energy, so it kind of broke down quite elegantly, sort of by itself. So if you have we have a little chart too. We could, you've seen it, I
Right.
know, but we have under energy, there's sort of four subsections. So each pillar has neatly four subsections. So under energy, we had engineers do the model as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to like, um, you know, the other approaches to doing it, which is based more like on physics, but we actually had like engineers like who
Mm-hmm.
understand how like things happen in the industrial economy.
Yeah.
So our four sections are a little bit different than like say how Bill Gates divides it. But it's basically types of energy. So there's energy that you use to energy in the form of electrons, and energy in the form of heat, and then energy in the form of moving things, mobility.
Mm.
And then there's the fourth one, which is kind of actually my favorite, but the least understood is what some people call it negawatts. So that's efficiency,
Mm.
which is a whole other subset that always gets missed because everyone
Right.
wants to fund the shiny things. But
Right.
efficiency is a huge part of the solution. So
Sure.
the energy side, there's those four. Underneath those, there's a whole set. So like under power, electricity, wind turbines,
Right.
it's a pathway, right? And so
Right.
under that, there are specific solutions. And then under nature, like you said, there's the conservation side, which is protecting what we already have. And then
Mm.
there's the restoration side, which is bringing back ecosystems to where they were, especially on degraded land. So we don't
Mhm.
want to ever displace anyone or do anything like that. But there's tons of degraded land. I mean, it's absolutely massive how much degraded
Mm.
land there is.
Mhm.
So in our model, you've got to restore about 350 million hectares of land. And then there's on the ag side, for example, there's you know soil carbon farming, like how do you actually farm so that you add carbon
Mhm.
over time rather than extracting carbon over time
Mhm.
and turn farms into a solution instead of a problem.
Right.
Those are like the three examples of those pillars.
It's such an ambitious undertaking to both model and then also prescribe solutions or to identify solutions. Who are you working with? How are you kind of finding the expertise and coordinating all of
Yeah.
that?
Well, I mean, we're just, like I said, we're so lucky in the beginning because we built out this bench of scientists that, and scientists are skittish a lot. They're kind of like, uh, they're very comfortable in certain. They don't really like to go out on a limb much. But
Mm.
we were like, we're not going to really fund NGOs. We want to fund practicing academics. And we built out a bench, just the most amazing set
Mm.
of, and there's a kind of, I guess I'd say that for each of those three, there's a small core group, and then they have their networks, and we've actually built out to this. Right now, I think we're about to do paper number 40.
Wow.
So we're at 40 peer reviewed and technical papers since we launched like 2018, and it's just kind of keeps unfolding, and
Yeah.
like some scientists will be like, "Oh, you worked on that," like so it's
Mm.
all bits and pieces of the information we need. Just one example recently is we supported the first ever map of ancient, or now we call it mature and old growth forests in the U.S. No one had ever done that.
Mm.
It's like so all these like U.S. NGOs trying to find like the global South, and like we don't actually know where our stuff is.
Mm.
So that was an amazing process because they got hubs. The one science, the was two scientists brought in some modelers, and they got little core groups in each of the regions of the U.S. to start working on definitions, and they did their maps, and we got a really fantastic peer reviewed paper out of that gives that map for the first time. So
Nice.
these are all bits and pieces we need because we need
Mhm.
to like kind of like that. Justin's probably said this, but the global blueprint, right? Like
Right.
we have to kind of keep building that.
And so why this part of the work, the science, the papers, the research, like you've sat on multiple aspects of whether it was the comm side with, Leo's gifted social media accounts or the funding sides. And is it to inform policymakers because we need to, kind of understand things? Is it to inform private sector? Is it to go after
Yeah.
funders? Like, what's the aim or set of aims?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, originally, if I'm going to be very honest, it was because of the audience. We were like, we had the foundation head. It was obviously a very famous person, and famous people are risk averse, right? Like,
Mm,
so if going to go out on things,
mm,
and we're not going with the mainstream, right?
right.
Like we're proposing much more advanced
Hmm.
ideas.
Yeah, because at that point, it was just 2 degrees and 400 parts per million, and that's
Oh
basically
yeah.
the narrative,
No,
right?
1.5 was like not settled.
Right.
Like, I mean, that was really their whole massive amazing. I could do a
Yeah,
whole
yeah, yeah,
podcast
yeah,
on
yeah.
just one
Yeah,
because I was
yeah, yeah.
involved in net zero, like
Well,
introducing net zero. Not at LDF, but yeah. So I mean, it was really going against the grain in many ways. We were going against the nuclear grain. We were going against there's a whole crazy thing on BECS, which I don't know if you
mm,
know much about bioenergy. Basically, let's burn forests and
yeah,
stick the emissions underground caverns.
yeah.
And that was in all of the climate models when we started. So
Mhm,
yeah, basically it was like, okay, so if we're going to do this big thing and
mhm.
not do doom and gloom, because guess what? It's really easy to do doom and gloom.
Yeah,
It's super easy.
totally.
Just throw up Johan Rockstrom's chart. You're done. To do the other thing is about 100,000 times more work. So we were like, okay, well, if we're going to do this, we got to do this. Like we
Yeah.
have to like have the best of the best, like the
Mm,
most IPCC authors, preeminent, but they were kind of a bit of like the free radical, like the ones that had gained enough stature that
mm,
they were free to actually
right.
they weren't they weren't
Speak
shackled
authentically. Yeah,
by NGO policy positions. They could just do science. And I was like, I don't care how this comes out.
right.
Like if you guys if nuclear comes out as the thing, like and that's more just and that's more efficient and that's better use of, like then that's what comes
Mm,
out. But yeah, so it was amazing. So it came out but that's the original why.
mhm.
And then the second why was about asset allocation. So that's like, how does a foundation, like, what are uh, foundations often get accused of kind of making decisions based on, nepotism or just
Yep,
like someone's friend, like said this was cool. And they were like, okay, here's $1 million.
yep.
And then, in the big NGOs, we were seeing a lot of extremely poor decision making
Mm,
that was disrupting communities. And as you know from talking to Justin, we like that's kind of like at the heart of One Earth is like Justin especially built really deep relationships with indigenous communities in North America and Latin America in particular, but elsewhere, and just really wanting to protect those communities.
mm,
Sometimes the money is like we mean good, we have good intentions, but actually that money ends up causing harm
right.
in various ways. So it was a lot like, well, okay, we need a model. We need models to help. This is me. I'm like, we need models. Like we need a methodology that's not just willy nilly. Like
Mhm,
we need science to inform like which are the most important bioregions to fund
mm,
in,
mhm.
which like where inside the bioregion is most important, like who's not getting what they need, who like so yeah, the model so kind of was those twin, I would say it's those twin things. So it was like, as how do we allocate a lot of capital because LDF
Yeah,
it's like 120 million roughly over a very short period of time. It's a lot of money to give out when you're a small organization. And then on the comms, yeah, like how do we actually communicate about this? So that's what
cool.
started. But now increasingly, like I told you earlier, like all of the now that it's matured and the One Earth Climate Model is quite well known and Global Safety Net is like we just had two home runs basically for
Mm,
our first two models. So Global Safety Net's being adopted like broadly by a lot of asset managers in the private sector, because they needed similar products too. Lo and behold, there weren't a lot of products for them. So we have now it's particularly spending a lot of time on asset, like how do we apply the assets that are invested now and move them into a nature positive economy. So that's now that's the sort of evolution of how those models are being used. But
Right.
yeah, definitely governments as well. That was like global safety net. The idea for that was no one, now we were coming from climate where there's tons of models. It's like hundreds of climate models.
Yeah.
There wasn't one single land use model to inform the Biodiversity Convention, which is the sister convention to the Climate Convention,
Right.
and not one single global analysis of priorities to inform this new big convention and the big new targets that were going to get renewed by all the world's governments. Well, not all the world's, but almost all the world's. And so that's what started that one.
And can you share more? What is global safety net model and a bit more detail?
Right. So the global safety net model is called Model 2 for the nature pillar. That was, again, another we modeled it off of how we structured the energy model. So it was a collaboration of scientists. And that result, there were two big papers. The first one's the most famous one, that was called the Global Deal for Nature. So that was like, we had a global deal for climate. We need a global deal for nature. Kind of obvious, but it was
not obvious at the
no
time.
one had done it. So we were like, okay, and I kind of just came in one day and I'm like, wait, no, we called all the big NGOs. And because I knew all these people, right? I'm like, wait, you guys have like climate program. Like you have, why you're a nature organization. Why don't you have like, we could never do this. Like, and then I remember it was a climate week. I don't know how many years ago. And I'm not going to say the name of the organization, but a very prominent nonprofit nature organization head of policy was like screaming at me. She's like, don't you dare. She said, don't you dare release this paper. Don't you dare do this paper.
Wow.
That's what she said. Don't you dare. So I hung up and I was
because why? They didn't want
this paper. and I was like, that's how I know I'm, So it was just to say this was not.
But the pushback is why? Because they felt
like, no, there's a lot we can unpack around the politics of the Biodiversity Convention versus the Climate Convention. They are structured in different ways. So the Biodiversity Convention ironically doesn't have any teeth, even though it's supposed to be for wildlife. And it was just, I think, probably, again, well-meaning fear that you don't want to spook the governments who are participating. And if suddenly there's a bigger target and they're responsible for more. So, but anyway, we did it. And so 30 by 30, like our paper introduced 30 by 30 formally into the scientific literature. A lot of stuff I've had, people on both sides mad at me about 30 by 30. The paper goes 30 by 30 was meant to be like a stepping stone. So for people who don't know, that means protecting 30% of lands and oceans by 2030. But our modeling showed that we needed much, much more than that. We actually it roughly worked out to 49 point something percent, roughly 50%. And we're in the version 2 of that model now. But what you can do once you have a model like that, which we compiled 16 other models. It was a huge sort of largely a data processing, but there was some novel research in there as well, creating sort of 6 types of conservation areas on land. And then once you have that, you can then put your country outlines and say, oh, well, this country should be doing this and that country should be doing that. So that's what they didn't like. That because we were putting out a piece of spatial analysis that could make many governments uncomfortable,
right?
Including governments who were like hosting, because at the UN, different governments are hosting different years, and so. But we were like, well, just like science is science, we got to get it out. So that's kind of how Global Deal for Nature started, and then the global safety net is like the mapping part of it, which was a whole other year, a lot of more data processing to like be able to visualize that basically and get those really accurate statistics. So we ended up just published in Manga Bay innocently in an index, so Global Safety Net Index, which ranked countries based on how well they were doing in protecting their biologically important land. And that I can tell you was definitely controversial. And then later that would turned out to be like probably the smartest thing we ever did, because no one had ever done that. And
Interesting.
it put countries on notice that, okay, someone's actually, which is very mature in climate. Like
Right.
countries are used to being looked at for their
Yeah.
climate emissions,
Yeah. Their
but not for,
NDCs and their emissions and so forth, but not so much for
not
nature.
so much for nature. So yeah, so that was, and that has been fascinating how that, who's uptake,
Right.
who uptake those models. Because it's surprising. We did not set out, like, for instance, to influence capital markets, but
Right.
that there was a lot of adoption there. But yeah, we know countries are looking at stuff. We don't require any, maybe stupidly, we never required anyone to log in and tell us who they were. We wanted it to be as
Open.
anonymous as possible, so people could just,
Mm-hmm.
and we have anecdotally know that a lot of people from country ministries have been looking at the map, and we can see where they're going. At pretty much 196 countries have used the app. So we know they're looking at it. So it kind of morphed, I guess, from those different sectors. I guess maybe the kernel was the people, then
Right.
it became the philanthropists, then it became government, and then became sort of asset managers, the asset allocators.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Anecdotally, being part of conversations, like I remember when I went down to Ecuador and they were talking about the unfairness that Ecuador was kind of using a lot of the indigenous lands to account for its kind of 30 by 30 target. But, actually there was a lot of tension between the government and those indigenous territories, and kind of like, well, okay, you're taking credit for all of this land that we've preserved, but we're getting none of the actual economic benefit, and only actually reverse. Or in New Zealand, where we already have more than a third of the land under conservation stewardship. Of course, there's also a justice lens to that, because those were lands that were taken from Maori, indigenous peoples before. But also this idea that, okay, well, it's not like we can pat ourselves on the back and say job done. Most of that land is in this one adjacent area on the South Island. And we had a great conversation with a gentleman named John Reed from Eco Index, and he's kind of mapping the native habitat and vegetation at a watershed level.
Wow.
And kind of, making sure that places understand where their kind of council by council, area by area, their tipping points are and their targets should be in terms of the wildlife habitat. So just going down in nested scales. But obviously, 30 by 30, I think it's a really compelling mimetic framework, especially, hopefully we get to E.O. Wilson's Half Earth, framework, and maybe 2050, and but it does, it's simplistic at a high level, and there's obviously nuance underneath.
It's such a great point you raised about the indigenous nesting, like, if you want to call it that, because that was another point we made in this paper, which no one ever forget. I think this is the most important point in the global safety net paper, was that 37%, according to our very crude, because the data it's getting better
perfect,
on indigenous territories, like demarcation, because there's a whole sort of, they don't do maps the way we do kind of issue.
Exactly.
But knowing, we relied on some colleagues' paper, and we found really roughly 37% of all land that's biologically important is technically already protected by indigenous people, right?
Right.
And some of that does overlap a little bit with protected areas. So if you want to think about it, we're at 17% of land being quote unquote protected. There's another, like, roughly, I should have I'll have a much more accurate number by the end of the year, but like roughly 18 to 19% that's protected, conserved by indigenous people. So we're well over 30 right now. Like, we're 33, 34, 35% protected. So why do we have a 30 by 30 target? And like, we should just grandfather in all of the indigenous people, and then we can get them that conservation finance that, it's just absolutely some of my highlights of this week. We have some representatives from different tribes here, and I was just at an event earlier with the Sariaku. You look at, like, Hayapo in Brazil and Sariaku in Ecuador, like, they're managing huge tracts of land, highest biodiversity on earth, no money, huge pressures all around them, deforestation, and they're doing a great job.
Yep.
And there's actually papers studying like how do they do that. But yeah, like I hear directly from them. We're not getting any of this money that all these people here are talking about, and everyone's saying indigenous this and indigenous that. So yeah, that was kind of like our one issue is like the target needs to be bigger because it should be 50 because we just need to automatically grandfather all indigenous tribes and fund them to do that, keep doing what they've been doing for like thousands of years.
Totally.
And that is a key thing. I'm constantly trying to figure out how do we do that? I know you have some good ideas on that too. But yeah, that's
well, I think for anyone that's watching from the crypto Web3 lens, I mean, we got to connect this with the ideas that are being batted around with retroactive public goods funding. If that is coming across as a mouthful of gobbledygook, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it in other conversations. But I think that, I mean, at a personal level, we talk mostly on this show about kind of finance and technology and so forth. I remember having this distinct, spiritual experience laying in the forest down in the South Island of New Zealand, and just, suddenly having it really hit me how the existing intact ecosystems are like the only things kind of holding the tissues of our planet together. Right. And like they are so vitally important that we protect what's already there. And if, these indigenous land stewards and peoples of all, heritages are the ones doing that work, like how do we support them to persist in the face of this machine that is just destroying so much around us?
Yeah. Man, that sounds like a cool experience.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, I feel you, man. I mean, it's, I was saying this. Was a big donor roundtable with a lot of foundations. They're like, "What do we do about nature and climate?" And I'm like, "Well, we have to start like if carbon is the beginning, is alpha in the alphabet. We need to be talking about how living is the carbon, how alive is the carbon, how wet is the carbon. Like carbon isn't, on paper, carbon dioxide molecule is pretty much the same, but it's like, we need to get like this living gradient of the livingness of the carbon, to try and like sandwich two languages together, sort of.
Totally.
So yeah, I think that's something, I think it could emerge. I mean, I think, we'll see. I mean, I think there is potential for the market to come back, but it just has to be better and different. And, we just need to get that finance to the people who are there.
Right.
Like, that's the critical intervention.
Okay. So many topics we haven't even started to discuss. I knew this was going to be a far-reaching conversation, Karl, but it seems like there's an evolution of the global safety net or an iteration around conservation imperatives, which has been a big paper for you this year. Can you share more?
Yeah. We had 2 peer-reviewed papers that I was co-authors on out this year. Conservation imperatives was the big one. So that is, if people have seen the global safety net, it's like we also rebooted the app. I don't know if you know that, but we have this. We migrated over to a much easier to use platform. Not on Google. It's on Mapbox now. So, but that if people have seen it, there's sort of color coded layers of the map. So dark green is existing protected areas. And then we have medium green, which is high biodiversity areas that aren't protected. Light green are areas that are seasonally or migrationally important for biodiversity. And then we have these blue layers, which are more about like ecosystem integrity and carbon. The magenta is the one that pops out. There's this like hot pink layer. So that's called conservation imperatives, which is the last remaining fragments of habitat harboring rare and threatened species. And that's plant and animal. So that combines 6 different studies, plus some little bit of novel stuff. But yeah, so we have that magenta layer. So we re-released that at 100 times higher. So you go in orders of magnitude from the previous one, which is a kilometer resolution. And we found that half of the areas that everyone is saying are key biodiversity areas that we need to protect are already gone. So they're already degraded, lost, converted to palm plantations or other things. So it was a very advanced. I didn't know how big of a deal it was going to be. Honestly, when we started, I was like, "Hey guys, let's just like get out a paper on this," and it turned out to be a huge thing. But we actually identified the 4,000 like most important sites on Earth that we need to like protect yesterday to
Mm,
reverse the extinction crisis. So this paper was really about extinctions, like how do we
mm,
stop extinctions? So these were the front lines of where extinctions are happening. There's 4,000 sites. There's actually 16,000 sites, but there's 4,000 sort of larger sites.
mm,
And those are distributed in very specific bioregions. And we also did a proximity analysis. So, like, how close are those areas to other, we call them refugia or protected areas or indigenous lands that are harboring species? Can we connect them?
mm.
Like, so how do we like, it's sort of like triage in a hospital. Like, how do we get these patients connected into what they need? Some new,
Right.
so they can mate and they can disperse seeds and they can
Mm,
do all the stuff we need to do in biosphere. So that's that paper and Frontiers in Science. By the way, it's like the science they came to us and I'm like I kind of chuckle. I was like, this is like the most impossible journal to get into next to Nature or Science, but out of they have 200 journals and they picked us. Our paper is one of 20 to feature this year, so we got
mm,
special treatment from them, which was really nice, and they helped launch the paper. Yeah, but I think that will be influential in the upcoming
mm.
biodiversity convention happening in Colombia.
And what's kind of the headline about how much land area comprises those conservation imperatives?
Yeah, it's 1% of land.
Got it.
So yeah, we used to think it was close, yeah, 2 point something. I think it's about 1% of land that is unprotected, harboring these rare species.
I see. So this is the flashing red or flashing magenta, highest priority areas to stem extinction and loss of key habitat and species, um, based on the fact that it's unprotected land
Yeah,
and the fact that it's in a biodiversity hot spot
yeah.
zone. But it's not to be misinterpreted as only 1% of land needs to
Oh
be
yeah.
protected.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying that.
Right.
Absolutely not. Yeah, we need to protect 50
Right.
or just keep that number in your head. Like eventually we need to get to protecting, conserving, and restoring 50% of land. But that
Mm,
tip of the spear is that hot pink area. So we got to just do that. We say like next 3 to 5 years. So
right.
we calculated land acquisition costs and rough conservation costs and things like that to do that.
Hmm. Got it. Well, that makes sense. I mean, it seems like the solutions framework, these types of models, maps are giving, I can certainly see it from a funder perspective, a framework. I was on a call that it was a bunch of, you know, the context was climate philanthropy. And all these different groups were introducing themselves and what they were working on in terms of funding climate. And it was astonishing how many of them started with, well, this is our first time going into this area, right?
Wow.
And, it's fairly modest size
Yeah.
funders in the grand scheme of things. But I was just kind of feeling this like, okay, like money's coming in, but they're all just trying to make sense of the space.
Yeah.
So what are the frameworks and like who do we fund? How do we fund it? And like, okay, here's the solution sets, here's the pillars, here's the maps, here's kind of the key hotspots and priority areas. Like that's extremely helpful to have a body of work that is peer reviewed and no one's saying it's the only models
Yeah.
or that it's perfect, but at least some starting frameworks and some places to look.
Yeah, that's nice to hear. I mean, that's
Mm.
kind of how what we felt like. What would we want?
Hmm.
And
Yep.
what would we wish we had when we started like $120 million foundation? Yeah,
Yep.
and
Mm.
it's we were kind of like sort of like feeling the elephant in the dark. It kind of felt like sometimes, but
Yeah.
the other cool thing that's part, and I think some of the climate solutions opportunity map project. I don't know if you know about that, but we're also now we have a couple of data scientists that are mapping deal flow so into
Cool.
climate and nature and that's in private money. So
Mm.
and it includes philanthropy. So we originally started with philanthropy, but then like, well, we should be scraping impact investing and private equity and venture capital and how are they getting tagged. And so now we have
Mm.
this really cool project where our climate model we're interfacing with their data scraping on how
Sweet.
funders are tagging their deals,
Mm.
and we're going to be able to, of those 77 solutions, we'll put them in a gradient of like super important and
Cool.
overfunded, super important, underfunded, that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
that kind of just helps you get like a little lay of the land of like, oh, that
Right.
one's really interesting. It's super underfunded. So
And that's a geospatial map, or it's a
no, that's like,
solutions
yeah,
map?
sorry, I use map a lot.
Yeah. Solutions
But that
map.
one
Yeah.
it's really, it's like
Right.
data mapping. But that's
Yeah,
kind
and I
of,
remember being at one of your events and seeing like it was like renewables, like whoosh, a lot more funding, and then like
yeah.
rights of nature missing,
Oh yeah.
and like
Well, I mean, top takeaway is that nature, I mean, within energy, there's mismatches, but
mm,
then nature just gets nothing.
right,
I mean, it's like
right,
nada.
right,
And then regen ag is like, I mean, there's some cool stuff having impact
mm,
investing in particular
mm-hmm,
around regenerative agriculture, but nature is like, there's no commodity output, right? Like
yeah,
except oxygen and life and beauty and being able to wake up in the morning.
just that,
So
yeah,
just that, right? Like
right.
it's hard to trade that. So,
Yeah. So it must be exciting to you to see it go from Climate Week to Climate and Nature Week, because we're starting to see the momentum. Another trend that you and I have kind of touched on briefly before this discussion, this new wave of bioregionalism, and you guys were very early on this as well. Tell me about the work you've done around bioregions, historically, and then would love to ask you some questions about what we're seeing today.
yeah. Bioregions. It's I have no idea. It's just we've been working on it for a while. Like
Mm-hmm.
we have this like kind of luxurious opportunity to kind of like what's needed. Like
Mm,
we had this giant whiteboard session, and we're like, hey, we need like where bioregions for us came from is that nature doesn't care that much about political boundaries or administrative boundaries, shall we say? Like,
right.
you'll have an ecoregion, which is sort of a beta diversity is sort of a way to kind of classify turnover of land, or like when one land type sort of changes into another. There's 844 ecoregions. We use that framework. There's a few other frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
They all do slightly different things, but we use the terrestrial ecoregions. One of our core authors, we piggybacked on his work.
And that includes oceans.
So there's a group of scientists on the terrestrial,
Mm,
and then there is a set of marine ecoregions as well,
I see.
and that was the different. And WWF played in the early days. There's a whole. I did a literature review of the origin of bioregions and ecoregions. So if anyone wants to read that, it's a long piece on that, because I felt like people need to know the history of it. It's
Totally.
fascinating history. But I
Yeah.
mean, really, as someone, I mean, we're like, someone has to write a book, and I'm like, I think I'm gonna write a book on this, because this is really interesting how this fundamental idea that could reshape how we interact
Yeah.
with the world in the 21st century
Totally.
is probably going to be bioregion. So
Mm,
the idea was like, okay, we're protecting land and communities and like trying to do all this stuff, but we're using these weird straitjackets to
mm,
define that. Like, why
mhm,
would we talk about one ecoregion? There's half of it's in Ecuador and half of it's in Brazil. Like, why are we dividing this? That makes no
mhm,
sense. So we're like, surely someone, once
mhm,
again, surely somebody has a model for bioregions, how we can group these. So instead of looking at nature country by country,
mhm,
we're letting nature create the countries and using data science to help do that. So like, how would nature? So I did this TED talk last year. How would nature, if nature could draw a map of the world, what would it look like? And so that's kind of where the bioregions idea came from. And
mm,
yeah, so that we ended up with 185 bioregions. So those group ecoregions, and they use really sort of structures that exist in nature, and that those can be climatological structures or hydrological structures
mm,
or topography, to cluster ecoregions into kind of relatively uniform polygons that don't overlap with each other, because that
mhm,
was part of our problem. Is we wanted data. We couldn't have blurry data, right? Like, if you're going to have a target for this part of the Amazon and another target for that part of the Amazon, you kind of have to delineate it.
mm,
So that's where the bioregions came from. So we were like super early in that. There were definitely some working groups of people doing bioregionalism.
mm,
I traced it back. It's just such a fascinating story. There's a marine biologist came up with the word that we think, because the first published instance of it is 1971, and it's on blue crabs, the mating life cycle of a blue crab, I think it's in Maine. And then that word got taken up by other marine biologists. So this bioregion, the idea was, well, it's the physical area that we can map in which a blue crab can live its life and get everything it needs. Later, the hippies got on board with it, right? Like, so then you get the cool hippies were like, oh, like, well, that's us too, right? Like and I don't, who started what, when. It's still like some people are claiming that it was this one sort of like person that did it. But I think it does appear to me to be rooted in academia ultimately, but it does branch out. Like there are, sort of in peer-reviewed literature, there's one sort of use of the word bioregion, and then in sort of bioregionalism, which is about how humans live in harmony with nature and design human nature systems. That's another trajectory, and bioregions can be defined in many ways, right?
Right.
But yeah, but yeah, so it kind of was this nerdy thing that honestly we thought, well, it's cool, right? Like, so we put it on our website. Absolutely, number one thing that people are interested in our website is the bioregions, like, because you can explore them on our site. So you can see the Earth, and you can turn the Earth around and click on a bioregion, and that opens up. We're working on the UI. I think it needs to be a little better, but it opens up a little guide where you can see the ecoregions, the animals, and the plants that are like really define that bioregion, all from a nature, largely terrestrial perspective. But to your point, your question about marine is that this was Justin's idea, because I came with a proposal of how to do the bioregions, and she was like, "Well, what about the oceans? Like, like, isn't the water right next to the bioregion kind of important?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, that's good point." So went back to the drawing board, talked to some marine biologists, and we kind of smushed together the marine bioregions with the terrestrial bioregions. So. Yeah, there's a little bit of it gets a little awkward, but there is a logic behind how we group those things. But yeah, our bioregions now extend out into the oceans.
So 185 bioregions in your map. I don't want to go too far into this, but there is some, I guess, discourse reemerging with this new wave of bioregionalism about, I mean, is it appropriate to even draw lines, say this is this bioregion, this is this, because does nature, those crabs go maybe over between those lines, and different species have different relationships to place. And when we start talking about governance and culture and, the current nation state paradigm that we have, and like, it's messy, it's complex.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I say anyone working or wrestling or referencing bioregions is a good thing, however they define it. Because, I think watersheds. So yeah, if people are interested in this, I really go quite deep into it, because you could say there are some sort of ecumenical battles, I guess, about it. And nature does not have hard lines, in a few rare instances, but for the most part. But in terms of like humans trying to do accounting. So like we needed a very precise and consistent way to sort of track progress. For us, it was the bioregions sort of became a layer on top of the global safety net, so that we could specifically track progress towards protecting those high biodiversity and biologically important areas and have a clear number.
Got it.
Because we need to create an index, you can't have blurry numbers. There is fuzzy math, and fuzzy math is actually very hard. So we were like, we're not smart enough to do fuzzy math, so we're going to do like clear math. So the polygons are, very precise, because we need to draw a line somewhere just so we can track,
right?
And maybe we're at 95% here or there, but it's like basically it allows that we have these distinct pieces that we can then each track the representation, and that's a key concept in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the Biodiversity Convention of the UN, is representation, ecological representation. So it's a trade-off between you want to make sure that each ecoregion is represented in the global protected area network. At the same time, you also want to protect rare species, and other things. So there's like and I was a co-author on a great paper that kind of boiled all of the thinking down with IUCN, which is a big union for conservation of nature. And That's it has a really unfortunately long, boring title. But if you Google like 6 principles of conservation, you'll find it. And so we kind of tiered those out into like priorities of how should a country or a state go about
Mm,
setting those priorities.
got it.
So yeah, so that the bioregions for us was a way to like track that progress.
Mm.
And
And
yeah.
with tracking progress, what do you make of the conversation around also the financing facilities in that kind of framework?
Yeah, well, we're super excited about that in the BioFi movement.
Hmm.
I can see well, and we supported that paper on bioregional financing facilities. And again, like the bioregion itself, the important thing is the money is moving into the bioregion, right?
Mm,
So how you define it, less important. But the yeah, so you could say the bioregions help us track progress. The other thing they could do theoretically, one of the things we've been thinking about are, how do we get to this magic number of $666 billion a year, which is what we need to
mm,
protect. Um, protect, like restore is still people are working on those numbers. So, but 666, that's kind of the number. That's a round number of how much money we would need to protect all of the stuff we have in the global safety net. How do you get that money? I mean,
mm,
where does that come from, right? Like carbon credits could at best do 50 billion maybe of that.
mhm.
And then, I mean, still super important. That would be like 50 times more than it's doing now. But, so one of the
Right.
cool things about bioregions is if you have a global system and the bioregions sort of are weighted based on ecological need,
Mhm.
you theoretically, and you had a sort of global capture mechanism for financial resources. Those could flow then quickly into
Mm.
bioregion finance facilities based on need.
Yep.
So this bio and that it's just an idea, but we have part of it. What we have to do, like obviously, our economy is not working right now,
Yep.
right? Like
Yep.
so, we have to we should aim to be, if we're wrong, let's be wrong on the crazy side, right? Like
Mhm.
let's really go for the big ideas. So there's some big ideas out there. Like could we do like global tariff, like a Tobin tax, if you will, like or I call it an earth fee. Just a few central bankers would have to agree to that. We could put a 1 basis point on Forex, which is a big currency trading platform, and get a whole huge chunk of that money and like that.
Mm.
Like
Mhm.
we could do this really quickly, but then the thing you always hear is like, well, we can't move the dollars, and even foundations say this. We have all this money, it's just we don't know where to put it, and that's like total bullshit. Like
Mhm.
One Earth houses an amazing index of like 180 fundable projects. Synchronicity Earth has another amazing. Daughters for Earth, Global Green Grants. Like there's all these there's thousands of amazing grassroots organizations that desperately need just a little bit of money,
Mhm.
but the big foundations they want to do big deals, so
Mhm.
they don't want to do all this little stuff, which is our problem. But yeah, so if bioregion facilities could help with that, because they could
Yeah.
aggregate that capital, then you
Yep.
could have a portfolio at the bioregion level, and then you just trickle it out based on need.
Mhm.
And sure, you could do cool strategies and governance and all kinds of other stuff, but like at least you could start getting some life support
Yeah.
money to these organizations.
Yeah. Yeah, the reason I like it, and it's not to say that I don't have some concerns about it, but I like it because I do think that what you're saying, this mismatch between large pools of capital and small projects, we do need intermediating organizations, and doing that with kind of local bioregional scale know-how, I think is important. We have this massive financing gap, right? But I do think that the storms of capital are coming,
Yeah.
right? Like, and you see it every once in a while when a billionaire wakes up and says, "Oh my God," or they go through a divorce, and
Yeah.
the other partner says, "Oh, well, we're going to spend this down
Yeah.
in short order," and so you get these huge dislocations of funding that need to actually have the watersheds to capture that
Yeah.
and then put it into the right places. And maybe it starts in philanthropy and then it moves into, highly reactive governments when they have major droughts or
Mhm.
weather events, or, just huge climate refugee problems. And then maybe it starts happening in kind of, the deep fiat monetary policy of,
Mhm.
of massive money printing in response to global crises. Maybe it starts to happen also with new monetary currencies and instruments
Yeah.
altogether, and
Yeah.
blockchain and nature-based tokens and crypto, and so we need a global brain that is rooted in local place to distribute funds. And right now, I feel like it's time to start to really make sure that this infrastructure is there and that we can measure and track impact on the ground, make good decisions with local governance and at kind of bioregional and eco-regional scale, and then kind of keep scaling up, right?
Yeah.
Keep moving the capital. The regeneration will be funded. Like we gotta get it into the hands of those doing that stewardship work.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we look with tech. I mean, like think about like with satellite, the advances in satellite technology. I'm not going to talk about AI. We could talk about that, but everyone's like, it's just tech on AI, whatever you say. But AI is huge, obviously huge problems with AI. Currently, I don't see right now for our work being that useful. But I think like we have to kind of like, there's a really great paper that just came out on how the Kayapo tribe, there are 9,000 people that manage 9 million hectares. Deforestation all around them, and the scientists studied it, how they did it. Like how do you,
right.
How do so few people manage so much so well with no money? And they use a system where it's really almost like synapses of a brain. Like it's distributed governance where there's relative autonomy based on the distribution, the geographic distribution, but they all link into each other. They have messengers, and there's a collective governance, and like we need to like, so there's an academic now paper out on how they do it, and cool. I'm like, well, that's what we need to do with bioregional finance, because they're also needing the money too, by the way. But even in North America, like we need to have bioregional plans. So how do groups of people work together? Technology, I believe, could really help with that. Like we're just not kind of using it for that yet. I think in some of the Web3, like the distributed governance stuff, like it got kind of crashed with the crypto crash in some way, but like there were some really interesting experiments on collective governance, and it could get messy, obviously. So, but I mean, it's where we need to go. Like we have. And it's more resilient, right? Like, because if one decision maker at the World Bank is in charge of like one giant region of Africa, and that person leaves, like we need a system not like that. Where we can share the intelligence and we can share decision making, and I mean that's the future. That paper talks about some of that. But yeah, I know that stuff you work on and are interested in.
Yeah, fired up about it.
You know a lot more about it than I do.
Well, we're going to keep chronicling conversations in that space as well. We go to a big conference, which is kind of like the Climate Week of Crypto after this. And
cool.
Yeah, called DevCon. So we'll be publishing out more videos on the crypto side of things. But I feel like someone needs to make a movie out of your life, Karl. I mean, you've been at the front line of so many exciting things that have so many anecdotes and stories. And I'm just imagining, it would be like maybe a bit of a dark comedy in the beginning, hopefully a hopeful comedy towards the end. Thank you so much for sharing the time and space with us, for all the work that you do. Hats off to you and the team. How do people dive in, go deeper, and any final words that you want to share?
Oh yeah, well, thanks so much. I was so excited to talk to you. Like, even though it's weird, I didn't even notice that we're being recorded, because
it turns out
it's
there's
so
a
nice.
few cameras.
Like you're such a good conversationalist, and you're so insightful on these things. But yeah, so oneearth.org, super easy to remember. You spell out the word one though, earth.org. And we have the navigator there, which is that earth thing I described. Global links to all the other stuff I talked about. And for sure, if anyone wants to support, we constantly feeding hungry scientists. We're like, call me up, like, can I just have $5,000 so I can run another parallel computer? And I'm like, okay. We're always just an endless amount of research to do and to inform all this stuff. So and really cool projects, some of the most beautiful, amazing, inspiring. If you want to get inspired about like in these spaces in Climate Week in New York, we got like all these World Bank people and all the IMF and all of Wall Street people and big corporations, but like then you like who's actually doing the work, and you read their stories. So we've done, our team is just so great, and they turned a lot of the projects into stories so people can learn these indigenous, just these amazing, there's hundreds of amazing projects on there that if you need a hit of like something to be inspired about,
Yeah.
just go there, because it's thousands. Like, that's the thing, is global safety net is the name of the science paper, but Justin always likes to talk about RED, the global safety net of people. And that it's literally like there's this kind of, right now it's quite invisible, but this invisible like network, there's like this mesh of like millions of people around the earth that are actually doing stuff every day on the front lines of the climate crisis, saving biodiversity, and and saving heirloom seeds, and like propagating all these rare plants, and bringing species back, and rewilding, all this like cool stuff. So like when you tap into that, you can tap into the hopeful part of the future, which I think is what people need right now.
Karl, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun.
Yeah. Okay, to learn more, go to oneearth.org. For more conversations like this one, just go to maearth.com, including the one we had with Justin Winters from One Earth, as well as Brad Lebo, who's also involved with the project. You might also be interested in the conversation we had with Samantha Power from the BioFi project. All of those are available on our website, on our channel. Please like, share, subscribe, 5 stars, all the rest. We are here to elevate voices in the regenerative economy. We're publishing this out from New York Climate Week 2024. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.